Good afternoon. I am Doug Hostetter. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Israel-Palestine Working Group at the UN. The Israel-Palestine Working Group is a group of NGOs that are affiliated with the UN community through ECOSOC, and we view ourselves as being the dynamic bridge between Palestine and the UN community. We are working to maintain a just settlement to the conflict that would be in accordance to all international law, humanitarian law, and human rights laws. And we are working on the assumption that any just settlement would be consistent with Security Council 242, 338, 446, and we work to uphold the rights of all civilians to feel secure within their borders, to end the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, to uphold the rights of refugees and displaced people, to reaffirm East Jerusalem as a part of the occupied territories, and reaffirm the application of international law to Israel and Palestine. We are very fortunate today to have two prominent experts on the situation of Palestinians in the occupied territories. We'll start with Phyllis Bennis. Phyllis is an old friend and colleague from many years. She is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., where she directs the New Internationalism Project. She is also a fellow at the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. She's been a writer, analyst, and activist on the Middle East and UN issues for many years. She has served as an advisor to several top UN officials on the Middle East and UN. She is the author of 8 books, including Understanding Palestine and Israel Conflict, a primer. Phyllis.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you all for coming. It's always great to be back at 777. It's sort of like coming home. You know, when I used to work as a journalist at the UN, this was sort of where I would come when it just got too much at the UN. Somehow the microphones were always too high there also, but some things never change. You know, we were talking about what to focus on today, and we talked about the sort of immediacy of the questions facing Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, in the occupied Palestinian territory. And that is crucial, but I think it actually is an important recognition that has become more and more widely shared, that you cannot segregate out one sector of the Palestinians and one set of human rights violations if you're going to be consistent about human rights. And consistency about human rights, I think, is very important. So for those of us who look at the crisis, and it is a growing crisis, it's a bad crisis right now, and it's getting worse, it's not getting better. For those of us who look at that crisis and look at it from the vantage point of human rights, international law, and the centrality of the United Nations, that means that we can't limit it to just what's going on inside the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. We can't, in my view, limit it to support 4242 and 338, but we have to add 194 in there. And we have to look at the situation of all Palestinians who are facing these various versions of these human rights violations, whether it's those living under occupation in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and we must include Gaza there, despite the withdrawal of soldiers and settlers in 2005 from the territory of Gaza, Israeli control of borders, airspace, water, life, imports, exports, exit, entry, all of that under Israeli control means it is still occupied. It's a different kind of occupation. We can call it a siege as opposed to traditional occupation, but it is occupation nonetheless. We also have to look at the second-class status, third, fourth, fifth class perhaps, of Palestinian citizens inside Israel. And of course, the refugees who are now looking at moving into the 4th generation, who have been unable to return to their homes despite international law, both in general international law and the specific laws of UN Resolution 194 that allow the return and compensation. It often gets skewed to, they have the choice to set it somewhere else. They can either have return or compensation, when the actual terms of 194 says both. The right to return and compensation for those who have lost, in many cases, 60 years. So I think that's an important starting point when we look at what is now 45 years of occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, more than 60 years since the Nakba that first displaced Palestinians from what is now Israel, created the refugee crisis that remains. And what we're seeing is little bits of things on the edges. We saw yesterday, you all saw the release of some prisoners. That's great. For those 26 people, that's something to celebrate. But the notion that there's a small break in a thoroughly illegal action in which thousands of prisoners are held illegally inside Israeli territory in many cases, illegal to remove them from the occupied territory, and held after no trial, held under administrative detention, many of them. All of these things, to say that a small rectification of some of those violations is somehow an evidence of good faith on the Israeli part, on the part of the occupying power, I think really sort of begs the question, particularly when it's answered with the announcement of 1,500 new settlement approvals to be granted at the same time. So that's kind of the framework that we are looking at. There's not as much, as you all know, in the U.S. press these days. You know, Israel-Palestine has been usurped by the crisis in Syria, by the crisis in Egypt, now by the sort of fascinating crisis going on in Saudi Arabia, as well as the Iran crisis. They're all linked, but we're hearing far less about the crisis in Israel and Palestine for the easy reason that the crisis is quiet these days. That because there is no overt resistance, that's when we hear about it. When we hear about the situation overall, it's because somebody fought back. They may have fought back legally, they may have fought back illegally, because as you know, not all resistance is legal. Some acts of resistance are illegal. We hear about all of them, legal and illegal, without any distinction. But we don't hear about the acts of violence that constitute the occupation itself. And so when there is no visible resistance, I was just talking to my colleague David Wildman, who just came back, and he said one of the things he noticed is that there's no evidence that anybody in Israel is feeling like there's any particular threat. People are, getting in, the roads are full. This is not a war scenario when people are afraid of violent attacks going on. And so we don't hear about it, because we don't hear what happens in the Palestinian territories and those violations. So the question has to come up, why are the talks resuming now? What's going on now? I would say it has far more to do with what's happening in this country than anything that's happening on the other side of the world. It has a lot to do with the fact that the Obama administration has realized that they don't have a strategy for how to deal with the crisis in Syria, for how to deal with the crisis in Egypt, for how to deal now with this new crisis in Saudi Arabia, for how to deal with ending the war in a faster basis and a full basis in Afghanistan. The consequences of their war in Iraq, they are stuck. They are really strategically stuck. And there was a sense that, okay, if we can't do anything else, we know how to keep the peace talks going. Now that's way different than we know how to get to peace, let alone justice. But we know how to do peace talks. We've been doing that for a long time. We've had 22 years of peace talks, 22 years of failed diplomacy. Why not turn it into 23? Why not, right? Everybody likes talks. Now this is where Bibi Netanyahu had it right. Not the context, not what he was talking about, but what he said was right. He was talking about Iran, but what he said was, a bad agreement is worse than no agreement at all. And boy, is he right. The same is true when we're talking about Israel-Palestine. Talking, yes, is better than violence, but if the purpose of talking is to provide political cover to the extension of human rights violations, whether they are in the form of settlement expansion, more arrests, a tighter siege of Gaza, all of which is made easier if you can say, hey, you got nothing to say here, we're talking. we're talking. Peace process is underway. Peace process, peace process. If that's the purpose, then at that point you have to rethink. Is it true to say that it's always better to be talking than not talking? Sometimes it's not. Now, the other danger, of course, is that there will be enough pressure on the weaker side, which in this case is the side of the occupied, not the side of the occupier, that some leaders there will give in, will sign on to something that is not just, is not viable, is not comprehensive, is not grounded in international law and human rights, and ain't going to work, but they will sign it. That's a danger. That's always been a danger. It hasn't happened yet. Hopefully it won't happen this time. But it's always a danger. That pressure becomes unbearable on leaders. And, this is a serious problem, particularly when you have leaders whose election was a long time ago. These are people who were elected for a period of time, and that time has long passed. And yet there are no new elections, so there are no new leaders. So we have a serious problem of how the Obama administration is using these talks as a way of saying, we can do something about these regional crises. Now, as we know, the stuff going on in the region is not segregable from what happens in Israel-Palestine. Part of it is the political side. In all of these uprisings that characterize the Arab Spring, those that are still hopeful and those where hope has, I won't say been lost, but at least is much harder to come by. Hope is a small commodity these days. But everywhere, throughout the Arab uprisings, the question of Palestine remained central. It wasn't the central demand anywhere. The central demand was internal in every case. It was what that government was doing wrong to their own people. But the understanding of what Palestine represented symbolically was and remains at the core of every Arab uprising in the region. And in that context, what happens in Israel-Palestine has everything to do with those uprisings, and vice versa. The uprisings operate on the political conditions throughout the region, including in Israel-Palestine. So we're seeing the spillover from the crisis in Syria. We're seeing a huge spillover into Jordan, into Lebanon. We're seeing, what's happened to Yarmouk camp, the largest Palestinian camp in the world, of mainly 48 refugees, many of whom have now been made refugees 2, 3, 4 times, have now been made refugees again as the war in Syria spills over. The question of what happens in Lebanon, in Jordan, all of these have enormous impact on what happens to Palestinians and what happens to Palestine. In Egypt, the impact of the coup in Egypt that overthrew an elected government, however flawed, and reimposed military rule is having a huge deleterious effect on the people of Gaza. The closure of the Rafah crossing almost entirely, the destruction of almost all the tunnels that Palestinians in Gaza relied on when Israel has made such a tight siege. That siege is tighter than ever. So all of these things play a huge role, and we see the U.S. administration saying this is where we can have some influence. And then we come to the question of Iran. Iran is very, very important here. The question of Iran emerges as a potential threat to the Palestinians. How so? It's because there is, for the first time right now, this is where there is some real optimism that's deserved, I think. There is the possibility of either a grand bargain, or at least some kind of a narrow bargain between the U.S. and Iran, ostensibly over the nuclear issue, but in fact on the regional question of Iran's role in the region. Because any recognition of Iranian rights on nuclear questions, any resolution of the nuclear crisis, is going to have to include a recognition, more or less overtly stated, that Iran is a regional power that has a right to be in the region and to emerge as a major power that it is. If that happens, you know what the response is going to be from the occupying power, from Israel. And if that happens, there will be a price to pay. And that price will be paid by Palestinian rights. The model, I think, if we look back at the year 2004, when we saw the exchange of letters between Ariel Sharon and George Bush, where Bush essentially gave away a set of Palestinian rights in writing, as if they were his to give. He gave away the right of return. He said there will be no right of return to anywhere but the new Palestinian state. And he gave away massive territory and allowed the settlements to be legal, as if it was his right to do so. And there was no accountability for that. That's the kind of price, I'm afraid, we will see if there is, as I hope, I mean, because an agreement between the US and Iran would be a huge step forward away from the potential for a massive, horrifying war in that region and around the world. We are still on not quite the hair trigger we once were on, but there is still grave danger of war. And to stop that would be a huge, important contribution to world peace. But it will not come without a price. And it will be, ironically, the Palestinians who pay the price. So I think that's one of the things that we have to look at. What we actually see going on with these talks, you know, we might call them the Einstein talks. You all remember the Einstein theory of, you know, when you look at something and do it over and over again, expecting the results to be different. That's what the U.S. is doing this time. They're doing the same talks, led by the same people. And they even have Dennis Ross and Martin Indyk, for God's sakes, going in and leading it again. I mean, you want to talk about an Einstein theory. Do the same thing over and over and over again, and you think it's going to be different. Well, I got news for them. Einstein was right. What a surprise. He was a pretty smart guy. They know that now. They dissected his brain. It's kind of sick, but yes, they did. You know, I mean, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about doing it over and over and over again and thinking it's going to work this time. It hasn't worked for 22 years. Why do we think it's going to work now? So this is the problem that we hear. We heard it more explicitly this time in some ways from John Kerry. Kerry told us what are his goals for this round of the peace talks. He was very explicit. The goal is ending the conflict and ending the claims. Period, full stop. Not ending occupation, not ending apartheid, not ending segregation, not ending the siege, none of that. It was end the conflict, meaning stop fighting about it, accept it, accept what is, accept the facts on the ground. That's the unspoken part of that. And end the claims. That means that whatever is agreed to, however narrow, however small, you know, if it's a Swiss cheese like canton based on the border of the wall with non-contiguous pieces of territory. Sharon had that great line, transportational contiguity. You know, if you can drive from here to there, we'll call it contiguous. Even if you have to like go up in the sky on a bridge or go underground in a tunnel, we'll call it contiguous. You know, even if it's that, and it represents less than half of the 22% of historic Palestine that, you know, was left as a Palestinian state, even if it's that, whatever it is, that's going to be the end. And what does that mean? It means that anybody who says, excuse me, that's not quite enough. The refugees still don't have the right to go home. Palestinians are still living without sovereignty, without the right to make their own decisions about whether they want to, I would hope, choose to be nonviolent and not have an army, whether they would have control of their own airspace, the right for their fisher folk to go out in boats and fish. They won't have any of that. And as soon as somebody says, excuse me, we sort of deserve our other rights too, they will be considered almost a terrorist. That will be beyond the pale. Because, why? Because the agreement was the purpose of these talks is to end the conflict and end the claims. So once you end the claims, any more claims are out of order. They are out of order. And that's the challenge that we face. So why is Israel going along with this right now? Well, for one thing, they get to say, we're in the peace talks. Don't talk to us about settlements. We're in peace talks. And look at the timing. Now, there's a general timing consideration, which I mentioned, about the U.S. The U.S. pushed to get these talks started at a moment when they were like, oh my God, what are we doing in this region? But there was a more specific moment when the Israelis agreed. It was the day after the European Union announced sanctions. Now, the sanctions were little baby sanctions, but okay. This is the beginning of a slippery slope, I hope. Skiing is good on a slippery slope. Slippery slopes aren't all bad. Sometimes slippery slopes are good. The beginning of a good, important move is a good one. And what we saw was the European Union, for the first time, agreeing on a very narrowly defined sanction on Israel, having to do specifically with the labeling of settlement goods. Now, it's not even clear that everybody's going to do it. We don't know what impact it will actually have, but the symbolic value of it was huge. This was the first time that the European Union, which operates on the principle of unanimity, which means every country has a veto. You think the Security Council is a problem with 5 vetoes? Try it with however many members there are, 47 or something? 28, thank you. Other people know the EU much better than I do. That was a huge statement. That was a huge statement of unanimity, that this settlement process is unacceptable. Not just it's an obstacle to peace, move on. It's an obstacle to peace, it's a huge problem, and we're going to do something about it. And the Israelis responded by agreeing the next day to go back to the talks. Now, that's not much of an agreement, as I've said, because the talks aren't really pressuring them very much. I don't think they're going to lead to any serious Israeli concessions. But nonetheless, the problem with the disparity of power remains very, very strong. The U.S. said that these talks are going to be based on the Arab Peace Initiative. That could have been great. Coulda, woulda, shoulda. They could have been a contender if they did that. I had to say that. It's one of those great lines. You can't say coulda without saying that. They could have done it based on the Arab Peace Initiative, but they cut the guts out of it by saying, number one, we're going to give up what the Arab Peace Initiative said about full withdrawal. The Arab Peace Initiative promised normalization, normal relations between Israel and all the Arab countries if it followed full withdrawal from the occupied territories and the rights of refugees to return on the basis of 194, a just solution based on 194. All of that is out the window. So what does it mean to say it's based on the Arab Peace Initiative? It means it doesn't exist at all. So finally, I think that this question of what's really going to change the situation on the ground, it's not going to be those peace talks. The peace talks have another 5 months. They're going to end. I don't expect much response when they end because nobody seems to have much expectation about them. Nobody is sort of looking forward to the end of these talks. But what it means is that these U.S.-backed bilateral talks is not the way we're going to have a solution that is just and comprehensive and viable and just and just and just. It means we're going to have to rely on the international community, primarily civil society, to pressure our own governments to stop behaving the way they've behaved for, in some cases, 60 years and for others, 45 years, of accepting occupation, accepting apartheid. There is an international law that prohibits apartheid. And when you have one government that is in control of 2 populations on one piece of territory, however it's divided, and that one government treats them under 2, or in many cases 3 or 4, different legal systems for the purpose of discriminating against some and privileging others, that's the very essence of the Convention Against Apartheid. So mobilizing civil society to take on our own governments, in this country it means starting with military aid, in other countries it usually means the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign. That's what we have to do. That's how we're going to see a real change. That's how we're going to see a policy that finally will be based on human rights and international law and not based on power. Thank you.
We are extremely privileged to have Richard Falk with us this afternoon. He is one of America's leading intellectuals. He serves as the United States Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967. He's the Albert Milbank Professor Emeritus of International Law at Princeton University, the visiting Distinguished Professor in Global and International Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He is the author of more than 30 books and the editor and co-editor of more than 20 books. He is a fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences, a Guggenheim Fellow, the Olof Palme visiting professor in Stockholm, and a visiting distinguished professor at the Mediterranean Academy of Diplomatic Studies at the University of Malta. It is a pleasure to have you.
listening to Doug's introduction, I felt very old. As with Phyllis, it's a great pleasure to be back here. I've had many good memories in this building, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. I really have little that is fundamental to add to what Phyllis said so lucidly. I think she touched in a very penetrating and credible and reliable and important way on the essential features of where we find ourselves in relation to this conflict. And I want to underscore what Doug said in his initial introduction to the program itself about talking about the committee being dedicated to a just solution based on international law. That sounds like a bland statement that hardly should be even the subject of commentary, or not necessary to say. So it should be a presupposition of conflict resolution. But the truth is, it's at 180-degree angles with the prevailing approach, which is the contrast between the delineation of a solution based on international law, flexibly interpreted to take account of some realities that cannot be encompassed necessarily by legal rules, as opposed to a solution based on the disparity of power, where you take into account what the stronger side has managed to achieve, and that achieve through lawless activities. The interesting thing about the settlements is there's almost universal consensus that they violate the Article 49, Paragraph 6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Even the U.S. has said this at various times. Now they've changed the rhetoric, interestingly. Instead of calling them unlawful, they now call them unhelpful when Israel announces one more expansion of the settlements, in a particularly provocative way in the course of the negotiations. You have to ask what is in Israel's mind when they, at the one hand, indicate a willingness to resume negotiations, and at the same time do everything conceivable to make it very difficult for the Palestinian Authority to continue and to have any credibility with its own people. See, and that it poses a terrible dilemma. And if they are the ones that say we can't do this, then Israel says we have no partner for peace. So it's one of those diplomatic dilemmas. And if you think about this framework of injustice, where you have the stronger party in the diplomacy reinforced by the supposed diplomatic intermediary that is the unconditional friend of the stronger party. No couple angry with one another would choose the best friend of the rich spouse to be the intermediary in determining what a fair settlement is. And just to rub the Palestinian noses in this unfairness, as Phyllis pointed out, they appoint Martin Indyk as the special envoy, as if Israel needs an insurance policy that nothing can be done that would in any way offend Tel Aviv. That's not the way credible diplomacy aiming at a just outcome would be structured or conducted. And it's really important to realize the lack of ambiguity. See, this is not something that is subject to reasonable and alternate interpretations. They're clever enough, if they had wanted to create a credible framework. There are thousands of people in Washington waiting for the assignment of as special envoy. They don't have to appoint someone linked to AIPAC. Contrary to fact, if the intention was to reach a reasonable outcome, let's put aside for the moment they would disguise the imbalance of the framework by at least appointing somebody that was credible to both sides as a special envoy. It's a signal to the Palestinians, you do as we say, or you're going to be blamed for everything that goes wrong. See, that's the signal, I think, underneath. And I think that Phyllis made the important point about the absence of pressure in Israel to do anything. And there's, again, a fundamental issue here, that when there's violence, when there's violent resistance, Israel says, we refuse to deal with the Palestinians because they're engaged in violent activity. But when there's no violence, there's no pressure to engage. So it's a kind of tragic predicament. And I think many of us applaud the Palestinian shift in tactics to an essentially nonviolent strategy based on the mobilization of global civil society and the reliance on a solidarity movement, imitating to a large extent the anti-apartheid campaign that was so successful against South Africa. And I think it's important for those of us that are not Palestinian to make a distinction between the resistance to occupation, which in various nonviolent forms is continuing, in the form of hunger strikes in the prison system, in the form of various mobilizations around the world, from the solidarity movement. I think it's very important that the Palestinians understand that what the meaning of self-determination is determined by them, not by our deciding whether two states or one state or a confederation in the region is the approach. Self-determination means that the Palestinians are the self. And that's often forgotten even by people that wish the Palestinians the best. There's a kind of liberal pretension that one can override those that are victimized by the understanding that enlightened folks have of what is realistic and desirable. And I remember in the American Civil Rights Movement there was the same issue, and it took quite a lot of very, strong reactions by black activists to make white liberals appreciate that it was a African American victimization that was at stake, and that their understanding of what needed to be done should be given deference. It's a really important issue in my view. And again, to reinforce what Phyllis said, time is not neutral for the Palestinians. And that's part of why Israel and the United States don't mind continuing talks. because during the talks, anything that is said about Israeli violations of international law or the obstruction of Palestinian rights is said to be unhelpful to the peace process, and that all these issues will be dealt with in the peace process. And in the meantime, Israel accelerates the confiscation of land, demolition of houses, the building of settlements, and the expansion of settlements. And so at the end of each of these phases, not only are the Palestinians blamed for the failure and breakdown of the talks, even though they're induced often to enter them against their will and reassured in advance that they won't be blamed. Clinton went back on that reassurance back in the Camp David talks of 2000. They're blamed, but in addition, they lose additional land and they are faced with more settlers and more development of the settlements. So it's not a neutral phase. It needs to be understood as a tactic. And part of this, in trying to think about over the 6 years that I've had this role as special rapporteur, two elements of Israeli strategy have become very clear to me. One is what I call the politics of deflection, making people think about other things than the plight of the Palestinians and above all the rights of the Palestinians. And even the Iran, exaggeration of the Iran threat is part of getting the world to focus on Iran, and then, as Phyllis suggested, if they relax that focus a bit, giving Israel, rewarding Israel for doing that, which is extraordinary if you think through what that signifies, that you can act in a belligerent manner. People forget that a threat to use force is itself a violation of the UN Charter. The UN Charter says the threat or use of force. Israel and the United States have continuously talked about the military option not being taken off the table, and Israel said even stronger things. Those were acts that were punished at Nuremberg. There was a punishment of the threat to initiate aggressive uses of force. So that notion of deflecting, and I've experienced it, where the attacks on my reports emphasize the messenger, not the message. All of these attacks by UN Watch and by other groups, they don't want to talk about the substance, and they don't want to address the issues, because their positions are so weak on the issues. If you talk about refugees, if you talk about Jerusalem, if you talk about borders, if you talk about settlements, water, it's no contest. As I have kept saying all week, this week, you only need to be 10% objective to come to conclusions highly critical of Israel on all these international law outstanding issues. You don't have to be balanced. You just have to be not extremists, ideological extremists. That's all it would take. So on the one level, there is this incredibly sophisticated orchestration of the politics of deflection, and trying to blame the UN or blame the Human Rights Council or get the debate off the topic of the substance. And the second big strategy is what I would call the politics of fragmentation, and this is in the essence of this approach was embodied in the Oslo framework, the bisecting of the occupied territories into areas A, B, and C. Then the separation of Gaza from the West Bank, and to some extent from East Jerusalem. The encouragement of the conflict between Hamas and Fatah. The effort to divide the refugee community from Palestinians living under exile. The neglect of Palestinians behind the Green Line, the minority in Israel itself. So that on many dimensions of this conflict, this effort to induce fragmentation as a way of weakening the coherence and unity of the Palestinians, both in terms of their political identity, but also their presence on the ground, is quite pernicious in its overall effect, in my view. Let me just say two other things before Doug gets very angry at me. The first is that this is the 20th anniversary of the Oslo framework. And the Oslo framework was supposed to be a breakthrough for peace. But what it really has turned out to be is a breakthrough for occupation. And not occupation. Occupation itself has, in my view, become a euphemism. It's really de facto annexation, substantial de facto annexation. That, to some extent, in that Bush-Sharon exchange of letters, the United States tried to give a kind of de jure validation to. So you have that idea that in Oslo was both this kind of reinforcement of occupation and fragmentation and deflection, all of those features were embodied in this Oslo framework. And it was a fantastic mind game that fooled many of the Palestinians as well as much of world public opinion, that this was really designed toward achieving what Doug referred to in his introductory remarks. There's no evidence that any Israeli leadership, let alone the recent leadership of Netanyahu, was prepared to achieve a just settlement along the contours of what this committee proposes as fair and just. And that's important to remember. It's a very deep part of this reality that one has never had any evidence of an Israeli leadership that was prepared to reach a just peace, even that only gave the Palestinians 22% of historic Palestine, which is less than half of what the UN partition plan had decreed over the heads of the Palestinian people back in 1947. You know, the Palestinians are often blamed for rejecting this. But why, in an era of self-determination, why should the decision over the future of a mandated territory be made here in New York? In that way, it's just one step removed from the Balfour Declaration, that Lord Balfour had the authority to determine the future of the identity of Palestine, which is, pure colonialism. What happened in 47 was hybrid colonialism, but it had some of the same effects. And this relates to the idea that many people say, why does the UN spend so much time on Palestine compared to what's happening in Congo and other places, which arguably are worse for the population? But the UN uniquely has a responsibility for Palestine. it was a mandate. It was supposed to be a sacred trust of civilization. No other society has been as victimized by the failure of the UN to fulfill that mandate, as it was dumped in their lap by the British, who felt they couldn't handle it any longer back at the end of World War II. So it's a really important understanding, I think. That, and the other anniversary is the 10th anniversary of Edward Said's death. And Edward, who was a friend of both of us who are speaking here, was somebody who understood most of what we've been saying way back in. I remember conversations with him just as the Oslo principles were being enunciated. And he foresaw with sadness what it would lead to. He was not deluded. And his legacy is very important, I think, in both that kind of prophetic side, but also he had a vision of a just peace that encompassed both peoples. It was not an exclusionary vision. And it's a vision that one would like to see realized in on the Israeli side too. That we haven't heard those kind of prophetic voices with the same degree of conviction and passion and persuasiveness. So let me almost stop. I wanted to say just one other thing, and that is, and it again picks up on what, it should be understood that in relation to Gaza, there's both an immediate crisis that has been deepened by the developments in Egypt that have closed indefinitely the Rafah crossing, and has been combined with the destruction of the tunnels, which were used as a way of circumventing, to some extent, the blockade, so that the people of Gaza have been living in acute vulnerability for a long time, and particularly since the Hamas takeover in 2007. But now the regional developments create a really dangerous, they are approaching a precipice of real catastrophe. And in terms of individual well-being, there are terminal cases of various kinds of diseases where people can't get out, can't get the medical attention they were receiving in Cairo, and just in some cases Israel. And this means that you have a situation of real entrapment that we should take seriously as responsible citizens. In addition to the immediate crisis, it's a structural crisis that was pointed out in the UN report a year ago, that even if Israel didn't exist, it would be questionable whether Gaza would be habitable in 2020. And when we were there in December, the NGO people thought that was optimistic. The 2016 was a bit more realistic estimate. And that's because of water contamination and scarcity combined with the absence of sufficient agricultural land to deal with the food needs of the population. Let me stop there. I should have stopped earlier. But you know how this subject is.
Thank you very much. We have about a half an hour to continue this discussion if you are interested. I'll take questions. If you have a question, please identify yourself, and it's questions, not statements. Yes.
Yes, Jackie Redifera from Istana. UN, to both of you, I'm addressing is the problem is a matter of leadership. Because, during the Carter and so on, Clinton, there was some progress. The same thing in Israel is Netanyahu is the problem. So I address to both of you this question.
Doug, could you do a summary of the question for us, please?
We can't hear.
Okay. Actually, since you're in the post here, I'll let you, you'll be able to get a little amplification on this, please.
Okay, just I'm wondering whether the problem is a matter of leadership. During the Carter administration, there seemed to be some progress. And even during Clinton and Bush, definitely there was some progress. Now, of course, Netanyahu, it seems that he doesn't want really to negotiate. So his leadership here is the concern of all.
Okay, let's take a couple on this side.
I'm Martin Bailey. I was going to ask essentially the same question, but to put it in terms of the internal politics of both Israel and Palestine.
Okay, one on this side.
My name is Amira Hassan. I work for UNRWA's office here in New York. First, I wanted to thank you both for very, very interesting statements. It's been an honor actually to be here and listen to you. I have two questions. One of them leads on what Phyllis said with regards to the occupied being pressured into some sort of agreement. And it led me to think of something that happened here in the UN a couple of weeks ago in the Security Council with Saudi Arabia giving up their seat. There's been some talks on why they did it, and some of sort of the analysis that we've come to amongst colleagues could be linked to a potential resolution, if you want, on Palestine that it would be very, very difficult for Saudi Arabia to actually agree to, and having them in the Security Council maybe needing to abstain to that would be very problematic for them as the only Arab state, but also Saudi Arabia, so sort of the moral high ground of Islam, if you want. My second question, and I'll be brief, I would be very interested if you could speak a bit to the statehood, the non-observer status that Palestine now has, and what you see could be sort of the legal track that Palestine could choose to go down. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who would like to go first?
Thank you very much. Very good questions. Let me start with with Amira's questions first. In a sense, both of them reflect issues of power in the United Nations. I think that the decision of the Palestinians to move forward with the statehood process was a very important one. It was not without risks, as we all know. But it was a very important one. The problem is now it's been stalled. I think making the decision, agreeing to the U.S. demand that they not move forward to, for example, joining the ICC as a condition for joining the talks in response to what Israel was supposed to do in terms of releasing prisoners, is problematic on two levels. One is, I think, tactically, it sets back the potential value to Palestinian diplomacy of using that positioning at the United Nations. It makes possible a wealth of other things. And if we don't take advantage of that, then it's, by itself, it means very little. It's a one-off moment of celebration and then it's over. But the other part of it that I think is problematic is the message that it sends is that somehow a decision by the Palestinian leadership not to move forward on a perfectly legitimate and appropriate legal/political advance is somehow equivalent to Israel stopping one tiny bit of its myriad of violations. Those two things they're not just apples and oranges, they're like apples and golf carts. You know, they have nothing to do with each other, and they shouldn't be compared to each other. So I think that's problematic. The question of decision-making and the Saudi model, et cetera, I think goes to this question of what happens in the Security Council. And the model, I think, if we look back, it's still, some of you will remember the term the Yemen precedent around the UN, which happened during the first Gulf War, when Yemen was the only Arab country on the council, was under enormous pressure from the United States to endorse war against Iraq in 1990-91. Yemen refused. It had just been reunified. It couldn't do that. And no sooner had Abdullah al-Ashtal put down his hand, the Yemeni ambassador, than the U.S. ambassador was at his side saying, that will be the most expensive no vote you ever cast. And what a surprise, the mic was open and it was broadcast throughout the UN and quickly around the world. And a lot of people at the time said, oh God, it was so sloppy on the part of the U.S. ambassador, he never should have done that. I think many of us thought that it was quite deliberate, that the message was not to Yemen. At that time, nobody really cared very much about Yemen. Although they did, 3 days later, cut the entire U.S. aid budget to Yemen, $70 million. But the message was to the rest of the world. You cross us on something important and you will pay a price. And I think that's what the Saudis may well have been looking at. Now, how specific it was around their anticipating some kind of agreement, I don't know. But that certainly is possible. The one other thing I would raise, and I'll leave the question of the internal politics in Israel and Palestine, but on the question of leadership in the U.S. and Israel, I think there's, I guess my answer is no. I don't think it's a leadership question if we define leadership as the individuals who are presidents or prime ministers. It's a structural power question. I think that there is the illusion that when Labor was in power, when Olmert, when any of the labor leaders were in power in Israel, somehow it was better because the rhetoric was different. The rhetoric was not as extremist. But settlement construction was vastly worse under Labor than it ever was under Likud until the last couple of years. The early settlement process and the escalation of settlement was all under Labor. Rabin, who's revered as a peacemaker because he was assassinated by an Israeli right-winger, it forgets the fact that he was the one who called for breaking the bones of children during the first Intifada when he was defense minister. He was no peacenik. He was no peacemaker. And he didn't do anything to stop settlements to bring peace. It was just the rhetoric was different. I think in the U.S., it's also a systemic problem. I believe that Barack Obama understands the reality of Palestine probably better than any other president the U.S. has ever had, because he used to be a person before he was president. And when he was a person, he had the ability to do things in Chicago like have dinner with Edward Said. And no one who ever knew Edward knows, as anyone who ever knew Edward knows, you don't come away from a dinner with Edward unscathed, if you will. You learn things. So, he knew things about Palestine. But as president, it's not the person Barack Obama who is president. It's a different phenomenon, and I don't think that's where it really changes.
Well, I don't have much to add. I agree with Phyllis completely that I don't believe it's a leadership issue, no matter who was the leader. Maybe in both countries, it wouldn't change the fundamental posture. It is this structural issue. Now, if you had a leader that was willing to go outside the consensus in Washington, the Beltway consensus, and appeal to the, for instance, to the American people for a new kind of approach to the conflict, I think that would, at this point, succeed. But it would take a courageous leader who would face tremendously vicious backlash. And the Beltway is disconnected from the rest of the country on this issue, increasingly disconnected. And it's a failure of democracy in one sense, that I think the public would be much readier for a balanced approach to the conflict than are the think tanks, except for Phyllis's, in Washington, and the bureaucracy and the Congress particularly. So that, Israel is confusing in some ways, because I think there is, on one level, a peace sentiment, But on another level, there's a sense that unless there's real pressure to give up what is possessed, there's no reason to do it. You know, there's a kind of what one might call Hobbesian view of how to conduct policy, which is power-based, not rights-based. See, and that power-based understanding shapes what it is reasonable for an Israeli leadership to undertake. As far as I agree that the non-observer statehood could be utilized in much more creative ways, and part of the predicament of the Palestinian people is the passivity of the Palestinian Authority. And the passivity, to be sympathetic with it, is partly because they're under tremendous geopolitical pressure. And they pay a price if they do things that Tel Aviv and Washington don't want them to do. And one of the things they most don't want them to do is to take advantage of potential access to the International Criminal Court. So it would again take a leadership in Ramallah that is prepared to pay that price, and it would be enormously invigorating for the Palestinian popular movement if a leadership was to do that. And finally, the degree to which the internal politics of the two countries is relevant. It's relevant in the sense that it has frozen the conflict, but it's not relevant in generating alternatives. See, and that's, again, in my mind, both in Israel and the United States, it's a failure of democracy when on a question that is so fundamental, the citizenry has no choice, essentially. It really doesn't matter whether Democrats or Republicans are in the White House or in control of Congress. Maybe the rhetoric is a little calmer, not much, but a little calmer. For instance, in my own experience at the UN, I've had more hostile reactions during the Obama period than I did during the Bush period.
Thank you. I'll ask people to kind of come forward because this works better. So David, and then
I think maybe I could speak from here, or not. Okay.
Thank you both. I wanted to ask, I especially appreciate the last report and the previous report, Richard, the focus on corporate complicity in the occupation. And so I'd like to ask a couple questions to both of you, actually, though. Of what enforcement provisions do you see us needing to kind of advocate for in terms of addressing corporate complicity, both in terms of some of the case studies, but in terms of others? And related to that, it seems with your example of Dexia that banks are a critical aspect. And so if you could comment also on Israeli banks in particular, because every single Israeli bank has loans and intensive operations within the occupied territories. And then if I could just say the last thing is, you are finishing your term, so I would wonder if you have any great thoughts and recommendations of where to take the role of the special rapporteur in the next period. Thank you.
Again, thank you so much. Your statements were extraordinary. My question or reflection is, I don't know that I have as much optimism about the general American public. I just returned from a trip to the Holy Land with a group of relatively educated Christians, and their eyes were certainly open. They knew nothing. I wondered whether they lived under a rock. And I don't know how you bring the the plight of the Palestinians to the American public, who basically lumps most Arabs as terrorists, without the great support of the media. And just what's happened with Max Blumenthal's video that was shut down by some of the more liberal media even. I don't know how you teach them about the history. They don't know anything.
Identify yourself.
My name's Abigail Metzger, and I'm here sort of for Pax Christi.
One more question? Sure, come on in.
I can do it from my. I'm Tatiana Dwyer from United Methodist Women, and actually my question is to build on the previous question. Younger generations, they usually think in different ways, and not necessarily. So my question about what if you know and can like elaborate on what are trends in younger generations here in the U.S. and in Israel, and if we can hope that change may come through that, and when?
The 17th of March. Yeah, these are very good questions, and I am optimistic. I'll start with, I'll say one thing about the corporations and the enforcement. I'll leave most of that to Richard. But I think one thing we should be thinking about, which was an issue in the anti-apartheid movement around South Africa, when the banks were so crucial, as you mentioned, David, the role of the SWIFT code, which any of you who have ever had to deal with international transfers, you know what the SWIFT code is. That code that each bank has to make transfers among banks. So if I go to my bank and I want to send money to somebody in Switzerland, I have to put in the SWIFT code. It turns out that the SWIFT code is not an international agency. It's not a UN agency. It's a corporation in Belgium. It's a Belgian corporation, and that's what they do. There could be, and some of us have been trying to work with some activists in Belgium, a move to get the SWIFT code just canceled for Israeli banks as a way of stopping their complicity in the occupied territories. Now, there's a terrific guy named Terry Crawford Brown in South Africa who has worked throughout the last 40 years against apartheid, who invented that strategy for South Africa. He didn't ever succeed fully, but he got close, and it's a model that I think we can look at. I think Richard will probably have some other specifics, but I think that in the big picture, we should be clear that none of this just happens in a way that's inevitable. It's decisions made or not made by specific corporations in specific countries, run by individuals who can make different decisions. On the question of how people learn and what they learn, I think that I write a lot about the question of discourse. There has been a huge shift in the discourse in this country. Yes, there are still enormous fightbacks. The stuff that happened with Max's film, there's all kinds of terrible stuff going on. But if you look at the mainstream media, look at the coverage of the 60th anniversary of the Nakba a few years ago. The front page of the New York Times had to use the word Nakba and define it. It had to have Palestinian voices. Now, did they get it right every time? Of course they didn't. But 3 years before that, you would not have seen a Palestinian voice or any need by anyone in the media to have a Palestinian participant in that debate. An organization like IMEU, the Institute for Middle East Understanding, whose focus is laser sharp on getting Palestinian voices into the mainstream media. My friend Yusuf Munayyer, the director of the Palestine Center in Washington, has had 3 op-eds in the last couple of months in the New York Times. This is a huge shift in what the mainstream media is all about. The distinction between the shift in discourse and the shift in policy, or lack thereof, goes directly to the heart of what Richard is describing as the democratic deficit in this country. That's the challenge that we have now. I work with the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation, which has now over 400 member organizations. Many of your organizations are among them. When we started, we were 9 organizations and 15 very nervous people meeting right next door here saying, what the hell are we doing? And we have seen such a huge shift That organization would not have lasted 12 years. We would not have grown to 400 organizations without this shift. Now, we've been part of that shift as well. The young people, college campuses now, if you look at the work of Jewish Voice for Peace and their youth group called Young Jewish Proud, and Students for Justice in Palestine, the two together have far more influence, I would argue, on campuses right now than the Israel Project and AIPAC. It doesn't mean they have more money. They don't. And I urge you all to consider that. But they have enormous credibility in a way that AIPAC no longer does. AIPAC can still go to Congress with their millions that they control. They don't give the money, but they control it, and threaten. They can still do that. But they can no longer come and say, we've got the money and we've got the votes, which they once could say. The shift within the Jewish community is enormous. I don't get called a self-hating Jew very often anymore. Really, hardly at all. I mean, even Richard doesn't very often. I mean, once in a while. He does better work than me. But, you know, it's been an enormous shift so that these things they're just not happening the way they used to. I mean, 25 years ago, the JDL shot into my house in LA. They didn't like the nice Jewish girl doing bad stuff. They don't do that anymore. They're not a presence anymore. So, you know, this notion that nothing has changed is really wrong. The policy has not changed, and that's the new challenge. But boy, is that a different challenge than what it used to be of how do we change minds. And finally, just on the question of resources, there is now a host there's new curricula being developed for grade school, middle school, high school, universities. My little primer, some of you have seen it, that little Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict, it's like a website in a book. You know, it's little, it's cheap. It's now in its 5th printing. We've sold 30,000 of them. I haven't sold 30,000 of anything, ever. All of my other books together, you know. Only that one, because people like it. It's sort of easy. You kind of look up what's the question you have, and there it is. That kind of stuff, mine isn't the only one. There's a ton of them out there. And that's happening all the time now. It's taken for granted that if you're going to study the issue, you can't just read the early Zionist writers. You can't just read the Israel new historians. You have to read Palestinian voices. You have to read Edward Said. Maybe you don't read Orientalism, but you read Covering Islam, or whatever. You know, it's just a whole different world in terms of what people are learning and knowing. And so it's going to be the young people. The reason, and I'll end with this, some of you saw the video of the challenge to Netanyahu when he came to New Orleans 2 years ago. When he came to do the keynote for the, it wasn't AIPAC, it was the second biggest Jewish mobilization in the U.S. It's the Council of Jewish Federation, the Association of Jewish Federation Councils. 8,000 people at the dinner, 800 tables for 10. And Netanyahu gets up to speak, and he starts talking about those who would discredit Israel, those who would try to discredit Israel. And just as he said it, this incredible young woman stands up, pulls a banner out from under her shirt, holds it up and says, "It's the settlements that discredit Israel. It's the settlements." And people are frozen. And you see on the video, it's somebody sneaking a video with their cell phone, you see faces that are frozen with fear. And after a minute, they kind of grab her and rough her up and throw her out. Netanyahu starts again, and 30 seconds into his speech, a young man, 10 tables over, stands up, does the same thing. 6 of them, one after another after another. And the fear on the faces of these people who had been looking, oh, we have such a nice little Jewish girl here. It's so good to see the young people are here with us. Oops. Turns out, not so much. It was amazing to watch these incredibly brave young people. They were all from Young Jewish Proud, and boy, were they something. So when you see that, you know it's going to be the generation. They're the ones that are going to change it all.
Also, thanks for the very good questions. As far as my replacement is concerned, I'd be happiest with Phyllis or her clone, if there is such a thing.
God forbid.
I don't think God
Well, God if she had anything to say.
I completely agree with her assessment of the changed environment within which this discourse is developing. It really is really has created a disconnect which didn't exist 5 years ago. And we wouldn't be talking about a disconnect 5 years ago. So there is something different. But how we get something different within the Beltway, that's the challenge that I don't have the imagination to understand how to overcome. But it is the challenge. David's important question about corporate complicity. Let me make a general comment that I think this turn toward corporate responsibility as something that the UN and civil society both promote is a very positive development. Because from the UN angle, it's taking a baby step beyond ritualistic condemnations. You know, for years and every year, these resolutions are passed that have no traction in behavioral terms. This is at least doing something. It may not, it's a gesture at this point, but it's a gesture that's tangible. And by the angry and pained reaction, it isn't being greeted with indifference, which seems to me a good sign that there is a serious pushback from the Israeli side. In my view, the enforcement issue is less important at this stage than convincing corporations that they're doing things that are problematic under international law. And it's that language that the Dutch government used in this dissuading royal Haskoning from continuing a project in East Jerusalem that was connected with settlement there. And that's it seems to me that's a real breakthrough when a government that is seen as one of the more pro-Israeli governments in Europe tells a major corporation that it is risking, that what it's doing is problematic under international law, and the corporation responds by saying it's terminating the project, its participation in the project, and it's doing so because it has been told that it's problematic. Part of its public statement was that it's problematic under international law. It seems to me that if one can spread that kind of understanding, it will have an impact, and that some people have been talking about, you know, how does one create criminal accountability and other things. That's, in my view, theoretically correct, but is a evasion of the real opportunity to make this campaign first broadly supported and effective. And I agree that the banks are a very important sector of this effort. I'm not an expert on the Israeli banks, so I don't want to make any very specific comments about it. I know Phyllis has called my attention to this SWIFT code strategy in the past, and we'll have to do it again, because I think it is worth pursuing, and that it'll be my first assignment to the next special rapporteur.
Thank you, I guess.
Okay, we're approaching the end of our time. I think we have time for a couple more in the back. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, I come from Sweden, from the other side of the Atlantic. So Jan Lönn is my name. And of course, it's always a privilege to listen to Richard and to Phyllis. I just wanted to raise this issue of the European role, which unfortunately I don't think it is going in the right direction right now, because there are no baby sanctions. There is no directive yet on the issue of settlement products. And in fact, several European governments have started to say there will never be that. And with regard to the directive that exists from the EU Commission on the rules for EU support to project cooperation with Israeli entities, that is now to be implemented in a sensitive manner, as they say, and they are negotiating with Israel on how to do it in a meaningless way. And we know that that is going to be the case. It's not going to have any other effect except the political statement from the side of the European Commission that we now believe very firmly that the settlements are illegal, but that's something that they have always had as a position. Another thing which is very alarming, and that has to do with the Human Rights Council, as we have special rapporteurs here, and that is in order for Israel to return to the human rights machinery of the UN. That is like the UPR monitoring meeting that took place 2 days ago. The European Union and Israel concluded an agreement that if we do this, you will come back or try to come back to part of the UN human rights machinery. And what they agreed, and what the EU has done now for 2 meetings of the Human Rights Council, and has agreed for the next 2 years to come, that is to boycott the very item 7 of the order of the day of the Human Rights Council, that is on Palestinian rights. So the EU has agreed, in order just to satisfy Israel, they are going to boycott the debate on Palestinian rights in the United Nations Human Rights Council. So to end the Israeli boycott of the human rights mechanism, the EU is boycotting the discussion under item 7. And that is a very serious matter, because here it is actually the validity of discussing Palestinian rights that is the question. Namely, here it's not a question of they say Israel is targeting here, it's so unjust and so on. But that's not the case. There is no item on Israel. There is an item on human rights under occupation. So it's an issue of occupation. There is no other situation of this sort of permanent occupation for this long time, at least not in this way. So it is, I think it's very important to understand that we have a very dangerous development in terms of threatening the recognition of Palestinian rights and transferring that to this business-like negotiations and so on.
Thank you very much. And the last question is yours.
Thank you. In the context, I'm Perry Wooten, just a guy. In the context of your previous comments about the inside the Beltway and so forth, much is being written about Obama's bad relations with Israel. Israel doesn't like him, poor relation with Netanyahu, and all this sort of thing. Clearly, he is not all the inside of the Beltway, but in the context of your statements regarding change of approach and so forth, one would assume that he's trying to change the approach, whether or not one agrees with it, trying to change the approach. Is this the case in your interpretation or not? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, just quickly on Jan's point, I think we have a long way to go in terms of the European position. But I would, I guess, disagree with you that I think political statements are very important. The political statement, when you had particularly getting the Netherlands and Germany to sign on to a unified European statement about condemning the settlements and saying that they're illegal and saying that there would be something done about it, even if this first time it doesn't actually happen, that's hugely important. That's hugely important. Is it enough? Of course it isn't. And we need to keep the pressure on. Now, I'm not familiar with the other thing that you mentioned, the agreement between Israel and the EU. That sounds very dangerous. I hadn't heard that there was that kind of official agreement. I would be surprised if it was acknowledged by the Europeans that such an agreement had been made. I hadn't heard about that. We should check it out, but that does sound dangerous. But again, I think that it's largely because civil society in Europe has put so much pressure on those governments that they have felt compelled to take new positions. And that's all important. The democratic deficit exists in Europe as well as in the US, but not as bad. So there's more of a chance that continued fighting in Europe is going to win out sooner, I think, than here. But can we give up the fight? Absolutely not. That's the lesson of all this. We have to keep fighting it. On the question of Obama's relationship to Israel, the Obama-Netanyahu thing, some of that was a bit of a false, it was really a canard. You know, there was this view in the summer of 2010, you all remember, this is when Biden had gone to meet with Netanyahu, and while he's there, they announced these new settlements in Ramat Shlomo, just the same ones they announced today, the same 1,500 settlements. They still haven't built them. They're just using it as a slap around every time. And you heard all this stuff. Oh my God, you know, Obama is fighting with Israel. He's throwing Israel under a bus. Well, there was no bus. He didn't throw anybody anywhere. If there had been a real fight, it would have been, okay, you know those settlements? You got to stop. If, you know, that's just the deal. And then Israel comes back and says, no. Okay, you're an independent country, you can do what you want, but you know that $3.5 billion we're giving you this year in military aid? You can kiss that goodbye. And you know how we protect you in the United Nations so that you're never held accountable for human rights violations? We're not doing that anymore. That's step one of pressure. We didn't hear anything remotely resembling pressure. There was no pressure. There was a sense, I mean, I have no doubt that Biden and Obama were really, really angry at what the Israelis did. It was incredibly insulting. For Biden having this settlement announced while he's there, with Obama when he had to sit there drumming his fingers on the arm of the chair and listening to Netanyahu lecture him like he was an errant schoolboy. I mean, talk about racism, talk about insults. It was horrific. And was he bowing to the pro-Israel lobby at that moment? Absolutely. Absolutely. That's what he was doing. But substantively, that wasn't that much of a collapse. I think that it was a standard, there just wasn't that much of a change. I think what is true is that on the level of military aid, and the Israelis have said this over and over again, Obama has been a better friend to Israel than any president in history. Now, whether that matches his own private innermost feelings, probably not, but that's pretty irrelevant. What's relevant is what he does. And what he does is give $3.5 billion a year, no holds barred, of military aid, and announced that he's already in negotiations to up that to more than about $4.2 billion a year for 10 years, starting now. I mean, so that as soon as this 10-year tranche ends, the next bigger one will begin. So, I mean, this is a pretty strong relationship that we have to deal with. And it's not just because there's an Israel lobby. There's the whole question of the military contractors and the war machine wants those deals with Israel as well.
See, I would interpret this in a slightly different way, that despite the terrible relationship between Netanyahu and Obama, the policy doesn't change. See, and it's not only what the incidents that Phyllis referred to, it's also the fact that Netanyahu made no secret of backing Romney in the presidential election. It seemed to me that gave a great opening to Obama to say, it's time for a new approach. But he didn't say that. In fact, he went to Jerusalem and gave an incredibly deferential speech to young Jewish to a young Jewish audience, and never spoke to the Palestinians. See, it would have been fine if he had spoken to both populations. You could say he was trying to create a better atmosphere. But to speak to only one side, and the side that is in control of the situation, seems to me to suggest how structural this problem has become, and how even though there was also the open mic when he told Sarkozy how horrible it was to have to deal with Netanyahu every single day, but still, he pleads for more military aid to the strongest military power in the region, facing no security threats whatsoever. I mean, it's an incredible, kind of schizophrenic sort of reality that one faces. I think Jan makes important contribution with his statement about the EU, and I would confirm what he said about this recent UPR agreement. It wasn't quite phrased as he put it, but the Europeans committed themselves not to participate in the debates on Palestinian rights for the next 2 sessions of the Human Rights Council. And that what they didn't do is insist, for instance, that Israel, if it's to return, cooperate, for instance, with the mandate on occupied Palestine.
Allowing the special rapporteur in, for instance.
Yes, it doesn't help me, but whoever takes over, it was a big disadvantage. I mean, it wasn't fun to be expelled and put in jail, but back in 2008. But it is important to do an adequate job to be able to have access to the existential reality of occupation, and you can get the facts and the law pretty straight without ever setting foot. You can't get that existential reality, which I felt when I went to Gaza, for instance, in December when the Rafah crossing was still open. And so it's extremely important that Israel, it's a minor thing in the bigger picture, but at least the Human Rights Council should have insisted that if Israel wants to participate, it has to cooperate.
Thank you, Richard Falk, Phyllis, Bennis, for this very insightful afternoon together. You go with our blessings and our thanks. Thank you.